My dad told everyone I was a gold digger after I married a wealthy man. 3 years later, he showed up at my front door, asking for a place to live. I always believed that the worst kind of betrayal wasn't the kind that came from strangers. It came from the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally. The day I married my husband should have been the happiest day of my life. Instead, it became the day my own father destroyed my reputation in front of everyone I had ever cared about. It started before the ceremony had even finished. I noticed whispers spreading across the reception hall like wildfire. Friends who had hugged me just an hour earlier suddenly avoided eye contact. My cousins stared with thinly disguised curiosity. Even my new in-laws looked uncomfortable, as if they had been told something they weren't sure they should believe. I didn't understand why, until my maid of honor quietly pulled me aside, her face drained of color. She showed me a series of posts that had appeared on Facebook during the ceremony. My father had uploaded childhood photos of me, alongside a lengthy caption accusing me of marrying my husband purely for his money. He claimed I had spent years chasing wealthy men, that I had manipulated an innocent millionaire into proposing, and that I had abandoned the family the moment someone richer came along. The post ended with a sentence that hundreds of people had already shared. Money can buy my daughter's loyalty, but it can never buy her character. Within an hour, relatives were forwarding screenshots into family group chats. By the end of the night, strangers I'd never met were calling me a gold digger. Some even congratulated my husband for finding out too late. I cried harder after reading those comments than I had walking down the aisle. The cruelest part wasn't that complete strangers believed him. It was that so many members of my own family did too. No one asked for my side. No one questioned why a father would publicly humiliate his daughter on her wedding day. They simply assumed he had to be telling the truth. After all, who would know his own daughter better than her father? Except they didn't know our history. They didn't know my father had spent most of my childhood reminding me that I was a financial burden because I wasn't a son. They didn't know he had borrowed money from me countless times and never repaid a single dollar. They didn't know that when I graduated college with honors, he barely showed up, but when my younger brother dropped out for the third time, Dad somehow found thousands of dollars to help him get back on his feet. And they definitely didn't know the one detail my father conveniently left out. I had met my husband long before either of us had any money. Back then, he drove a beat-up 10-year-old sedan that rattled every time it stopped at a traffic light. He rented a tiny apartment above an old bakery because it was all he could afford while building his software company. Most weekends, we'd split a single pizza because we were both trying to save every dollar we could. When we started dating, his bank account looked almost identical to mine. The fortune everyone envied didn't exist yet. We built our lives together from nothing. But my father never let facts get in the way of a story that made him look like the victim. And that lie would follow me for the next 3 years. For the next 3 years, I became the villain in a story I never wrote. Every family gathering felt like walking into a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. Aunts who used to hug me warmly now greeted me with polite smiles that never reached their eyes. Cousins joked about expensive vacations whenever I entered the room. If I arrived carrying a designer handbag my husband had bought me for my birthday, someone would inevitably whisper loud enough for everyone to hear. Must be nice spending someone else's money. Eventually, I stopped going altogether. It wasn't worth paying for gifts, driving hours to see family, and leaving in tears every single time. My father, meanwhile, enjoyed every minute of the attention. His original Facebook post had been shared thousands of times. Local gossip pages reposted it as another cautionary tale about women who married for money. Whenever someone praised him for speaking the truth, he happily accepted their sympathy without correcting a single misconception. He became known as the poor father abandoned by his greedy daughter. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't destroyed so many relationships. Friends I'd known since high school quietly drifted away. One bridesmaid admitted months later that she believed my father's story until she spent time with me again. She confessed she'd almost cut me out of her life because she assumed I'd changed after meeting my husband. The lies spread faster than the truth ever could. At first, I desperately tried to defend myself. I posted photos from the tiny apartment where my husband and I had started our lives together. I shared old pictures of us eating instant noodles while assembling secondhand furniture. I even uploaded screenshots proving we'd dated for years before his company exploded in value. None of it mattered. People didn't want evidence. They wanted drama. And my father's version was far more entertaining than reality. Eventually, I deleted every explanation. Silence became easier than arguing with people who had already made up their minds. Instead of fighting rumors, my husband and I focused on building the life we'd always dreamed about. His company kept growing beyond anyone's expectations. What started as 5 employees became 50, then 200. By the 3rd year of our marriage, investors were competing for the chance to work with him. Business magazines featured his story on their covers, calling him one of the fastest rising entrepreneurs in the industry. People assumed my life had become effortless overnight. They imagined luxury vacations, endless shopping sprees, and servants handling every inconvenience. What they never saw were the 18-hour workdays. The weekends my husband spent sleeping in his office, the anxiety attacks before investor meetings. The nights I stayed awake beside him while he questioned whether expanding too quickly would destroy everything we'd built. We earned every dollar. Nothing had been handed to us. As our finances improved, we quietly bought a beautiful home just outside the city. It wasn't a mansion designed to impress strangers. It was simply peaceful. Large windows overlooked a small lake. There was a garden where I spent Saturday mornings planting flowers. We adopted 2 rescue dogs that immediately claimed the furniture as their own. For the first time in my life, home actually felt safe. There were no screaming matches, no accusations, no constant demands for money, just peace. My father knew where we lived. He had found the address online shortly after we moved in. Every few months, he'd drive past the neighborhood, taking photos of the house from the street. Mutual relatives occasionally sent me screenshots he'd posted online. Look what my daughter bought after forgetting the family that raised her. Funny how she never has money for her parents anymore. Luxury changes people. He conveniently ignored one important fact. I hadn't given him money because I finally learned where every dollar went. It never paid bills. It never covered emergencies. It always disappeared into his gambling debts. I had spent nearly 10 years rescuing him from loans he promised would be the last. There was always another last time, until I finally said no. That was the moment I stopped being his daughter. And according to him, I became the gold digger who abandoned her family. For a while, it seemed like life had finally settled into something resembling peace. Then, one rainy Tuesday evening, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. Our friends always called before visiting, and every delivery had already arrived that afternoon. When I opened the front door, I almost didn't recognize the man standing on my porch. My father looked 20 years older than the last time I'd seen him. His expensive leather jacket had been replaced by a faded windbreaker stained around the cuffs. His hair, once carefully dyed every few weeks, was almost completely gray. Deep lines carved across his face, and the confidence he had worn like armor for most of his life had disappeared. Beside him sat 2 battered suitcases and several plastic grocery bags tied into knots. He wasn't visiting. He had nowhere else to go. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The only sound was rain hitting the stone walkway between us. Finally, he lowered his eyes. I need somewhere to stay. No apology. No acknowledgement of the damage he'd caused. Just a request, as though 3 years of public humiliation had never happened. I stared at him, searching for some sign that this was all a bad joke. Instead, I saw something I'd never imagined seeing on his face. Fear. He explained that he had lost his house. At first, I assumed the bank had foreclosed on it. The truth was even worse. Over the past 3 years, he'd convinced himself he could recover his gambling losses if he just made one more bet. When that failed, he borrowed money from friends. Then relatives. Then private lenders charging impossible interest rates. Every loan was supposed to be temporary. Every loss was supposed to be the last one. Instead, the debt snowballed until it swallowed everything. His savings disappeared. His retirement account vanished. Finally, he sold the house he'd spent decades bragging about owning outright, believing he could use the money to clear his debts. Within months, that money was gone too. The lenders weren't asking anymore. They were demanding. Some had already started showing up where he worked. Others had threatened legal action. He'd been fired after missing too many shifts trying to avoid creditors. Then came the part that almost made me laugh. He had gone to every single relative who had believed his lies about me. Every one of them. The same cousins who had mocked me. The same aunts who called me selfish. The same people who had shared his Facebook post thousands of times. Not one of them offered him a room. Some claimed they didn't have space. Others said their spouses weren't comfortable with it. A few simply stopped answering his calls altogether. The people who had applauded him online suddenly disappeared when he needed actual help. Only then did he remember he still had a daughter. Me. He stood in my doorway, dripping rainwater onto the welcome mat, waiting for compassion he had never once shown me. I should have felt triumphant. I should have enjoyed seeing karma unfold exactly the way people always say it does. Instead, I just felt tired. 3 years earlier, I had begged this man to stop destroying my life. He'd chosen his pride over his daughter. Now, with nothing left, he expected my kindness to erase everything. Behind me, I heard my husband walk into the hallway. He took one look at my father's suitcases and understood the situation immediately. Without saying a word, he rested a reassuring hand on my shoulder. He wasn't going to make this decision for me. But whatever I chose, he would stand beside me. And for the first time in years, I realized something. The man who had spent years calling me a gold digger had arrived at my multi-million-dollar home with nothing but 2 suitcases. Asking to live off the very wealth he had spent years telling the world I didn't deserve. I looked at my father for a long moment. 3 years earlier, I would have done almost anything to earn his approval. Now, standing in the doorway of the home I had built with my husband, I realized I didn't need it anymore. I stepped outside and quietly closed the front door behind me. Not because I wanted to protect the house. Because I didn't want this conversation to take place inside the home that had become my sanctuary. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. My father shifted, avoiding my eyes. For the first time in my life, he looked unsure of himself. "I'll only stay for a little while," he muttered. "Just until I get back on my feet." I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I asked him a question that had been sitting in my heart for 3 years. "Why me?" He frowned. "You've got plenty of room." "That's not what I asked." Silence. "You told the world I married my husband for money." Silence. "You told everyone I abandoned my family." Silence. "You destroyed relationships I spent years building." Still nothing. I took a slow breath. "So, why me?" He rubbed the back of his neck before finally saying the words I had expected. "Your family." Those 2 words hit me harder than any insult he'd ever thrown at me. Family. Where had that word been on my wedding day? Where had it been when thousands of strangers called me a parasite because of his lies? Where had it been when relatives stopped inviting me to birthdays, holidays, and reunions? He remembered I was family only after everyone else turned him away. I asked him one final question. "Did you ever tell them the truth?" He looked confused. "The relatives, the people online. Did you ever tell them I wasn't a gold digger?" His eyes dropped to the ground. I didn't think it mattered anymore. That answer told me everything. Even now, even after losing his home. Even after losing nearly everything. Protecting his pride mattered more than protecting his daughter. I nodded slowly. Then I reached into my purse and pulled out a business card. It belonged to a local extended stay hotel. I had helped one of our employees book a room there months earlier after his apartment flooded. I handed it to my father. "They rent by the month." His face fell. You're not letting me stay?" "No." He stared at me as though I had slapped him. "I don't understand." "I know. You have more bedrooms than you use." "I do." "You can afford it." "We can." His voice began rising. "So you're really leaving your own father homeless?" For a brief second, I saw the old version of him. The man who believed guilt was more powerful than accountability. The man who always assumed I would eventually give in. But I wasn't 22 anymore. I wasn't the daughter who apologized for problems she didn't create. I looked him straight in the eye. "No." His expression softened slightly, as though hope had returned. "I'm leaving the man who spent years convincing the world that I was worthless to face the consequences of his own choices." The hope disappeared. He started crying. Real tears. I had rarely seen my father cry. As a child, I would have broken down beside him. Now I simply watched. Not because I lacked compassion, because tears couldn't erase years of deliberate cruelty. He begged. He promised things would be different. He swore he'd make everything right. Then, almost as an afterthought, he said something that stopped me cold. "I'll delete the Facebook post." Delete it. Not apologize. Not admit it was a lie. Just delete it. As though removing the evidence would somehow erase 3 years of humiliation. I almost laughed. "It's too late." He looked at me helplessly. "I don't know what else to do." I nodded. "For the first time in your life, tell the truth." I turned around and walked back toward the front door. Before going inside, I looked over my shoulder one last time. If you really regret what you did, start by calling every relative you lied to. Tell them exactly what happened. Tell them I met my husband before he had money. Tell them you lied because you were angry I stopped paying your gambling debts. And tell them the daughter you called a gold digger is the only person who answered the door when you had nowhere left to go. Then I stepped inside. I locked the door. And this time, I didn't feel guilty. I stood behind the front window for several minutes, watching my father remain on the porch. He didn't knock again. He didn't shout. For the first time in my life, he had run out of excuses. Eventually, he picked up his worn suitcases and slowly walked down the driveway. His shoulders, once always squared with arrogance, were bent beneath the weight of choices that no one else had made for him. I thought that would be the last time I ever saw him. I was wrong. About a month later, my phone started buzzing nonstop. One by one, relatives began calling. At first, I assumed something terrible had happened. Instead, every conversation began the same way. "I owe you an apology." Confused, I opened Facebook for the first time in weeks. My father had posted again. But this time, there were no insults, no accusations, no carefully crafted story designed to make himself look like the victim. There was only the truth. He admitted that I had met my husband years before his company became successful. He admitted that I had financially supported him for nearly a decade. He admitted that he had developed a gambling addiction and had lied because he was angry when I finally refused to keep paying his debts. Most importantly, he admitted that I had never been a gold digger. I read the post 3 times because I could hardly believe it. The comments looked nothing like they had 3 years earlier. People who had once criticized me were now criticizing him. Others apologized for believing his lies without ever asking for my side. Several relatives privately confessed they felt ashamed for abandoning me so easily. An aunt who hadn't spoken to me since my wedding invited my husband and me to dinner. A cousin admitted he'd shared my father's original post without thinking twice. He said deleting it now felt meaningless because the damage had already been done. He was right. Some wounds don't disappear just because someone finally tells the truth. Trust isn't rebuilt with a Facebook status. It's rebuilt with years of consistent actions. My father called me a week later. I let it go to voicemail. His message was short. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for a place to live. He simply said he was sorry. It was the first genuine apology I had ever heard from him. I didn't call him back that day. Or the next. Forgiveness isn't something you owe someone because they're sorry. It's something you choose if and when you're ready. Months later, I learned through another relative that he'd checked himself into a gambling recovery program. He'd found a small apartment. He'd taken a modest job. For once, he was living within his means instead of chasing impossible shortcuts. I was glad. Not because I wanted him back in my life, but because I no longer wanted him to destroy his own. As for me, my husband and I continued building the quiet life we'd worked so hard to create. The lake behind our house still reflected the sunrise every morning. Our dogs still raced through the garden like they owned it. And every now and then, I'd catch myself smiling for no reason at all. Not because everything had turned out perfectly, but because I had finally learned the difference between guilt and responsibility. I wasn't responsible for my father's lies. I wasn't responsible for his gambling. And I wasn't responsible for saving someone who had spent years trying to tear me down. Sometimes people call that being cold. I call it finally having boundaries. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's this. The people who truly love you will never need to destroy your reputation to protect their own. And those who only remember your family when they need something, were never treating you like family in the first place. That's the end of today's Reddit story. Thanks for reading, and I'll see you in the next one.